As police in Delphi try to get justice for Libby German and Abby Williams, time is certainly against them. With each passing week, support from other departments is lost. Rich Van Wyk reports on what's behind a big push today to sort through all of the tips.
The number of investigators assigned to work full-time solving this double homicide in Delphi has dwindled from about 200 to 24. More than 100 police officers from 20 local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies ran down a list of 2,400 leads. Detectives agencies ran down a list of 2,400 leads. Detectives assigned to the case haven't had time to check out.
We're just trying to get caught up on the tips and leads that have been coming in.
In the days after Libby and Abby were found murdered in a secluded wooded area, police received as many as 500 tips a day. That number has fallen to less than 100. Dozens of local police departments that sent officers to help with the investigation have called those officers back home to combat crime in their own communities. State police say the cut in manpower isn't affecting the investigation. The workload is less and changing. Fewer investigators, they insist, is no indication that the unsolved homicide is becoming less important.
This investigation is definitely not dying. It's one of those situations where if we don't need the people, we don't want them here when they can go back home and do what they need to do at home.
Detectives have looked at roughly 300 potential suspects. They're looking for the one tip that helps them identify their prime suspect, photographed by one of the girls before they were killed.
I'm obviously not sure that the video showing Dan Doolin carrying those sheets of paper is the actual Richard Allen tip, but it sure caught my eye, especially since the video was from March of 2017. I mean, it might be the tip, I have no idea. But I likely think the 2017 interview with Richard Allen was conducted on February 14th or 15th, assuming the interview happened before the bridge guy photo was made public. Regardless, the Delphi case got off to a rough start. They had a killer who injected themselves in the case early on, coming forward as a witness, and somehow that tip didn't see the light of day until over 5 years later, which enabled this killer to hide in plain sight. How did this happen? One reason may be that they had too many cooks in the kitchen, which usually means not everyone is on the same page. The standards aren't clear, protocols don't get followed, people aren't sure who's supposed to do what. It sounded chaotic in the early days.
What happened was they developed a system where when there were tips or there were hints or there were reason to believe somebody was in the neighborhood, they would assign, we had so many officers working on it that the guys they give them sheets, in effect, go find these people and interview them about where they were that day and so on. And so there was this unbelievable manpower, totally unprecedented in my experience, working on this and enthusiastically and passionately. And
the Orion tip system could be the greatest thing in the world, but if the processes around how humans should interface with it aren't effective and clear to everyone, then the system is going to fail. It's like owning a Lamborghini and not knowing how to drive it.
John Perrine, I'm a public information officer for the Indiana State Police Indianapolis District. We have a lot of partners, FBI and several other federal agencies as well. So a lot of people are playing valuable parts in this case.
The FBI sets up a tip line that's used in conjunction with its powerful Orion computer database system, something typically unavailable to local police departments.
The Orion system allowed us to not just collect an extraordinary amount of information, human information from tips, but allowed us to properly categorize the data that we were receiving.
Several new developments in the Delphi murder case.
From the case against Richard Allen to the FBI's handling of the investigation early on. Let's get right to Emily Longnecker. And Emily, you actually just got new info about reports that Richard Allen could have been a suspect sooner?
Yeah, ladies, tonight a source close to the investigation confirmed to 13 News a clerical error from an FBI civilian employee led to Richard Allen being overlooked as a suspect in 2017, something the FBI disputes. They tell us the implication that a clerical error by an FBI employee led to years of delay in identifying Allen is misleading, and that their review shows FBI employees correctly followed procedure.
Richard Allen voluntarily approached a conservation officer named Dan Doolin and provided information about his presence near the Monon High Bridge around the time of the murders. The conservation officer or a lead detective may have classified Rick Allen's tip as unfounded. This classification typically means the information was initially deemed not credible or lacking sufficient basis for further action. This status could have led to the tip not being actively pursued or re-examined in subsequent investigations until much later. So now we have a man, Richard Allen, who was likely categorized as a useless witness, an underwhelming, unsuspecting, short man hiding in plain sight who was just a regular dude working at a CVS with a daughter of his own. So, with Richard Allen classified as someone not even to waste their time with, the hunt went on. And just like the previous years, the case once again stalled in 2022, which prompted investigators to review the case from the beginning, including old tips and files. It was only when investigators, re-examining the case files years later, came across this tip and reassessed its significance, leading to a renewed focus on Allen. And then, on September 21st, 2022, a set of new investigators who were reviewing prior tips came across Dan Doolin's tip narrative, and they brought it to Detective Liggett's attention so he could review it. Note, if the only error was that they called him Richard Whiteman, police would have been running around asking people if they knew anyone named Richard Whiteman. So I think it was more than just the name written down wrong. I think someone either made a decision to say the tip was unfounded, or they accidentally marked that the tip was unfounded.
In those early days, there were plenty of leads, but there was no great lead. People have asked me sometimes, was there a point where y'all knew who did it, but you couldn't prove it? No. When I was involved, that point was never reached. There was never a time where we thought, this is the person, we just don't have enough to charge.
It seemed in the Delphi murder case, when the case started to grow cold, investigators would do two things. One, externally engage the public for leads, like their press conference or YouTube videos. And two, internally, they would restart the investigation, bringing in fresh eyes or different agencies, so that they could look at the case from a different perspective, examining evidence, reviewing old tips, or exploring overlooked angles, ensuring no stone is left unturned.
The investigation has drawn tens of thousands of tips and produced thousands of leads, and finding Abby and Libby's killer remains the top priority. Call 6 Investigates has learned investigators have turned to different law enforcement agencies to review their work. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation and agents from other FBI field offices have taken a second look at the case. Their recommendations and conclusions are not being released, but their expertise is meant to assist in making sure no stone is left unturned.
Here are some clips showing their internal strategy of starting back at the beginning of the investigation when leads get cold.
I said all along, once we finish, we're going to start all over again. Yeah. I don't believe in a cold case. Right. With technology today, the way in which human beings communicate today, and with the interaction, I remember Jerry Holman and the sheriff of Carroll County saying once, when we're all done, we're going to start all over. Yeah. And that's exactly what we'll do.
2 investigators still work full-time on the case from the Delphi City building. The ISP Laboratory Division, Intelligence Team, and Fusion Center are still combing through the now 50,000 tips.
When we're done with all we have, we start over. Again, I think I got 18 tips yesterday, just me, here at my desk.
Now let's look at their external strategy and how they interact with the public when leads grow cold. The April 2019 press conference came at a time of desperation. Over 2 years had gone by, and the leads were cold. So, the ISP used a strategy right out of the FBI playbook on how to get leads. Think of it like the arcade game of whack-a-mole. The press conference was the moment the game was powered on, and law enforcement wanted to see if any moles would pop up. They did not know who the killer was at this time, but were hoping this press conference would make someone pop their head out of that hole by acting erratically, changing their appearance, or even attempt to flee, which can provide valuable leads to investigators. In essence, this press conference was more than just an announcement of new details. It was an investigative strategy, a psychological tactic to stir the water and provoke a response. It was about creating a scenario where the killer, or someone with vital information, might inadvertently reveal themselves, compelled by the sudden change in the investigation's narrative.
But for the first 2 years of the investigation, this one sketch was the face of the investigation.
We've received some criticism. I know this is coming too, so I'll just jump right on it. I think that I should have been the person that received the criticism when we released a second sketch. You know, we were a year and a half in, 2 years and 2 months in, on the April 22nd, 2019 press conference, and I'm very unapologetic about that.
And if they knew about Richard Allen back then, well, then they would have done a search of his property in 2019 and not have waited until October 2022. As different as the sketches look, they really are of the same person. People are just notoriously horrible about giving accurate witness descriptions. Now, if the sketches were really of two different people, here's what they would have done at the October 31st, 2022 Richard Allen arrest press conference. They would have said something like, with the arrest of the suspect matching the older sketch, our work is not complete yet. We're still actively seeking information related to the individual depicted in the younger guy sketch. We believe this person played a role in the tragic events, yada, yada, yada. We need them to come forward. But they didn't say that. They didn't say, yep, we got one guy. Now it's time to get the other one. Nope. They didn't say that because the sketches were of the same person, Richard Allen. And they only said it was two different people just for April of 2019. They gave the killer some time to react, and after nothing panned out, they went back to their original thoughts that young guy sketch and old guy sketch are of the same person on May 16th, 2019. Doug Carter went away from the sketches being two different people. He basically says here that the sketches are of the same person.
To look at both sketches anymore. You only want the newly released sketch, correct?
That's correct. But remember, a sketch is not a photograph.
Right.
It's something similar to a resemblance. And the likelihood of this being something between the two is probably pretty strong. But again, that's a subjective opinion based upon what I believe.
On October 31st, 2022, during the Richard Allen arrest press conference, the prosecution mentioned investigating other actors or individuals involved after an arrest. It doesn't mean that they're looking for other people who actually committed the murders, but they likely wanted to look into various possible roles, such as people who were accessory after the fact, meaning individuals who might have knowingly helped the suspect evade capture or prosecution after the crime was committed. Looking for other bad actors could have been investigating people who might have committed the following crimes: obstruction of justice, anyone intentionally interfered with the investigation by hiding evidence, providing false information, or influencing witnesses; failure to report a crime, people who had knowledge of the crime but did not inform law enforcement, potentially hindering the investigation; aiding and abetting, investigating if anyone provided support or assistance to the suspect in planning or committing the crime; tampering with evidence. Investigators were probably exploring whether if anyone altered, destroyed, or concealed any physical evidence related to the crime; withholding information, scrutinizing individuals who might have withheld critical information that could have led to an earlier arrest or provided significant leads. And the final one, they might have wanted to investigate if anyone provided financial or logistical support that indirectly facilitated the crime.
Allen has no criminal history, but Carroll County dispatch records show he had one encounter with police in 2015. The sheriff said it was a domestic issue where Allen was supposedly drunk and his wife took him to a Lafayette hospital. No law enforcement action was taken, but deputies were sent to his Delphi home to, quote, keep the peace. If he's found guilty, his old neighbors say he deserves the maximum punishment.
Now, I bet Rick Allen went to the bridge often planning to kill someone, and he was just waiting for the right girls to walk into his trap.
Delphi is a really small town. There's really not a whole lot to do. We don't have a movie theater or a bowling alley. We really have the parks, the trails, and that's kind of the main thing people would go out and do with their families or with their friends. We both loved photography, so we'd go out with our cameras or our cell phones and enjoy the trails and take pictures and do a thing called geocaching, where it's kind of like treasure hunting. We just enjoyed our time together out there.
I think the girls weren't lured there, that they just walked into Richard Allen's trap. And here's why. Rick Allen often went to the trails. Liberty German would also go to the trails. Rick and Liberty only lived a couple of miles from each other. Two people who live a couple of miles from each other, who have visited the same location numerous times, crossed paths. That doesn't sound too crazy, does it? Now, how about this statement? Two people who live a couple of miles from each other, who have visited the same location numerous times, needed a freaking catfisher from over 40 miles away to make sure that they crossed paths. Now, I do think Rick Allen likely viewed the Monon High Bridge as an ideal location for committing the type of crime he fantasized about. This bridge was a trap set for unsuspecting victims, similar to Israel Keys.
His strategy for hunting and killing innocent people.
Back when I was smart, I would let them come to me. Just remote area. But that other people go to as well. You might not get exactly what you're not much to choose from in a manner of speaking, but there's also no witnesses really. There's nobody else around.
Let's deal with this modus operandi point that he reveals, that he's like a spider in a web waiting for people to come to him as opposed to him going out searching for victims. That's quite unusual, isn't it?
Not necessarily. I mean, although it's rarer. So whereas a stalker will stalk an individual and follow them, what he's doing is stalking an area. He's laying out a trap and waiting for people to come into his lair.
Rick Allen's repeated visits to the bridge might indicate a patient predator, selecting the opportune moment to strike. On February 13, 2017, Rick went off to the trails, as he often did, and this time, he was determined to feel full power and control by committing murder. Rick's plan involved him wearing an excessive amount of jackets, a face covering to conceal his identity, he would need gloves to be sure not to leave DNA, and to reduce the likelihood of being caught. He also used a common strategy that killers use. He parked far away from his planned crime scene. Killers do this because they don't want their vehicles noticed at a crime scene. It's usually much easier to describe a car than a person who is concealed from head to toe. Also, to avoid detection, Rick made sure to park in a manner so that no one could see his back license plate, to prevent any association of his vehicle with the crime. Rick made sure to bring a hunting knife and a pistol, because those seem so necessary when checking your stock ticker or looking at fish. Rick seemed to be in a rush, but actually he just didn't want to be seen by people. He didn't want anyone to get a long look at him, and he didn't attack Betsy Blair because she didn't cross the bridge, aka go into his trap, and also she might have been older than his preferred victim choice. The evidence and circumstances surrounding the Delphi murders point towards Richard Allen as the sole perpetrator. His familiarity with the area, the strategic selection of the crime scene, the preparation for the crime, and the aftermath all align with a profile of a calculated solitary offender. This narrative excludes the involvement of other individuals like Keegan Kline, focusing solely on Allen's actions and decisions leading to the tragic events of February 13, 2017. I still can't figure out how Richard Allen and Keegan Kline would have known each other. Richard Allen seemed like a guy who would go out to the bars and play pool, and Keegan seemed like a basement-dwelling nerd who was online 24/7, and Rick Allen didn't even have social media that we are aware of, so I am just missing the connection, I guess. And in the absence of concrete evidence linking Keegan Kline's catfishing to Richard Allen's actions, it's reasonable to conclude that these events were coincidental and unrelated. If Keegan Kline, KK, was involved in the murders, he would have been charged by now. If law enforcement knew that Keegan Kline spoke to Libby the day she was killed, it's safe to say that law enforcement knew exactly how that conversation went. And if Keegan Kline, while catfishing, lured Libby out to the spot where she was killed, how has he not been charged with anything yet? I would think he would be charged with felony to murder, or something in relation to the murders, because in Indiana, an adult catfishing a minor could potentially be charged with a felony, especially if the catfishing involves sexual misconduct or intent to harm the minor. Under Indiana Code 354246, it's a level 5 felony for a person who is at least 18 years old to knowingly or intentionally solicit a child under 14 to engage in sexual activity. As we reflect on the complexities and twists of the Delphi case, let's not forget the real heart of this story, the lives of Abby and Libby. Their memories are a reminder of the preciousness of life and the importance of justice.